Pain travels through generations, often referred to as generational trauma or generational curses. This represents your grandparents. It may not have started with them, but we're going to start with them. They had some form of pain or trauma, whether it was handed back down from their parents or they endured it themselves. But either way, unintentionally, they passed it on to your parents because they didn't know any better. It wasn't their fault, whether it was lack of resources or knowledge. And this represents your parents who passed it on to you for the same story and the same reason, unintentionally. They didn't know any better. But now there's you. You have one of two options. You can either pass it down to your daughter or son, or it can end with you. But it's not going to be easy. It's going to come with a plethora of failed relationships, of just not understanding why you feel different, why there's so much pain and suffering that you feel like you have to heal from, and a lot of it isn't your fault. But guess what? Trauma isn't your fault, but it's your responsibility to heal from it. And eventually, you'll be able to love yourself, appreciate life, and realize the fact that it might have ran in your family until it ran into you. It's not easy, but it is possible.
This is a big one, the sinner concept. There's a book that used to be a nice book once upon a time, before the Council of Nicaea got a hold of it in 325 AD on behalf of the Roman Empire and changed some books around. Once upon a time, the book that we call the Bible now was about 20 times bigger than it is, and the word sinner wasn't used once. We were not ever looked on by God as lowly, pathetic, bad creatures that could be manipulated by guilt to hopefully get back into God's favor. Why? So we wouldn't have to feel so miserable all the time down here. So maybe we could have what we needed. So maybe we didn't have to be afraid of death. There are teachings, the teachings that we're beginning to bring back here. The Catholic teachings were part of biblical texts. See, the Bible, what became the Bible, was part of a much larger series of books called the Mahabharata books. They are the teachings of the inner Christ. They are the teachings that Jesus taught. They were the teachings that John the Baptist and Miriam taught, that the Essenes taught 2,000 years ago. They were the teachings that, after that, the Cathari of southern France taught and were killed for it in 1244 AD when they were exterminated by, again, the Church of Rome, I believe, the Roman Catholic Church. There have been pieces of these books and the information contained within them preserved mostly in verbal tradition since they were last given in physical text, which was in the time of Jeshua, or Jesus, 2,000 years ago. Actually, 10 AD is when they were translated into writing. Jeshua was born in 12 BC, and by 10 AD, he and the people around him began the translations on the Mahabharata texts. The Mahabharata texts are part of a larger, huge body of information called the Emerald Covenant CDD plates, Cloister Doratura plates. They're ancient holographic discs that were given to this race in 246,000 BC, I believe. Yes, our race is that old and older. They were the original founders' race records of who we were, why we were put here, what our commission was, how science worked, how spirit works, how stargates work, how ascension works, and how to have a good time while you're in 3D. Because God wanted us to have a good time, because God's a loving God, not a wrathful God. The Mahabharata teachings, which were the teachings that pertain specifically to the inner Christ, which is the inner Templar, the energy systems and consciousness and spirit systems that run the body hologram, they also had teachings of the Templar, what we're beginning the teachings of next weekend, where you're dealing with the body's anatomy, the body of the Earth's anatomy. The systems we'll learn about this weekend, about our subtle body anatomy, also pertain exactly and directly to the planet, to a galaxy, and to universes. It is the core template structure that the universe was built on, and every microcosmic aspect of the universe follows that same template pattern. It is the pattern by which energy from source circulates through the 15-dimensional system and individuates itself into all sorts of manifestations. These teachings, the teachings of the Mahabharata, the inner Christos, the inner Templar, were the teachings of the law of one. The law of one refers to a body of teachings that told us about our relationship to Source, where Source is a collective, intelligent consciousness, eternal, limitless, boundless, that chose, in order to understand itself better, to create a framework of reality where a hologram of three-dimensional manifestation could take place. So Source first turned itself into the hologram, the structures, dimensions, and time matrices, and energy body structures, and then Source continued to individuate itself, and it created suns and planets, stars, galaxies, and it continued to individuate itself, and it created life forms to live on those planets and stars and galaxies. The law of one teaches us that each and every one of us are a manifestation, a direct face and manifestation of the consciousness of God. Where is God? There comes a time when you really understand the breadth of the Maharata teachings, where you don't have a weird reaction to the statement of someone saying, I am God. It doesn't mean, I'm God and I'm your boss. I get to boss over you because I'm God and you're not. That's not what it means. It doesn't mean, I'm the creator of the universe and therefore I know everything and I can be arrogant about it and obnoxious. That's showing how much you don't think you're God, because ego doesn't fit into that consciousness. When you can say, I am God, you are acknowledging the fact that a piece of Source individualized itself as you. And you'll also recognize at the same time that every other being is also a piece of Source, individualized. Source is learning to know itself progressively, eternally, through manifesting itself in a multitude of forms. These are the teachings that Jesus taught. These are the teachings that the Essenes traveled from place to teach and got hunted by all sorts of people because of it. We have been taught in our cultures a gross twist and distortion of our relationship to God. We've been taught God is way out there someplace, and we're way down here someplace, and there's this big space in between the two. We have been taught that, not because they were the original teachings from Source, not because they were even the original teachings from Jesus. We were taught that because certain people, let's refer to them right now as the Illuminati Collective, who are in places of power since the Atlantean period, which technically ended in 9058 BC, they decided they'd like to run the world. They decided they would like to take over this planet and its stargates. And they decided the way to do that was to hijack the consciousness of the other life forms that lived here. And they knew Templar mechanics, so they knew how to do it. Templar mechanics, the inner Christos teachings, they were used and twisted in a way that created an ability by certain Illuminati forces. They call themselves Illuminati because they were illuminated, and it was a very arrogant way of looking at it. They had the technical teachings left, but what they lost contact with was the law of one. What they lost contact with was the feeling of Source within them, to where they could never hurt another life form because they knew it was only the self, because there was only one self. That was the God self, and that is all. The Illuminati races had the first distortions in genetic code on this planet. Their distortion in genetic code created within their consciousness a reciprocal distortion, where they began to make a division in their own understanding between God, themselves, and other people, to the point where they could inflict harm on other people and justify it by scientific teachings without having any conscience as to, or recognition that the people they were harming were another face, another aspect of themselves, because all were God. These teachings that once upon a time gave us freedom and the absolute free will joy to create, co-create with Source, the collective of what Source is. We were given those teachings for a joyful creation here, but they were taken and they were twisted into a control dogma. That control dogma took numerous types of forms. The first forms after Atlantis that came up through Sumerian culture, where we got stories of things like the god Marduk and these kind of things. We got creator god stories, God's Jehovah, God's Marduk, all sorts of gods. We had gods running around all over the place in the old Sumerian days. And then we had the Egyptian period, where even more gods came into the scene. And all of a sudden, gods weren't the living presence of spirit within you. Gods became things out there and beings who said, I'm your God. In other words, I'm your bully. We lost touch with the teachings that allowed the force and consciousness and cognition of being God to move through us. The teachings took us from saying, no, that's not right. This is God. You have to worship this out here, outside of yourself. Now, that couldn't have been done to us if the planetary grid distortions hadn't taken place. If that hadn't happened, if the things to the planetary grids hadn't happened and our DNA was functioning the way it was designed to function, nobody could have done that to us. Nobody could have told us a lie about the relationship to God, because we were a living embodiment of that knowing. But when our DNA became distorted, when our DNA templates became distorted, because the planetary grids became distorted, we lost the conscious awareness while we were in our 3D bodies of what our relationship to Source was. And it was very frightening, because we were an avatar race that was used to knowing that God was always with us and a part of us, and we were a part of God. We had